How wars are funded without tax increases. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. Cost estimate? Around $60 billion. The actual price tag? Over $2 trillion. And here's the kicker. Congress never raised your taxes to pay for it. So where did the money come from? Today, we're pulling back the curtain on one of the most carefully hidden secrets of modern warfare. How governments fund trillion-dollar wars without ever asking you to open your wallet. At least, not directly. What you're about to learn will fundamentally change how you view government spending, inflation, and the true cost of war. Because the money doesn't just appear out of thin air. Or does it? How wars are funded without tax increase, the historical context. Let's rewind for a moment. Throughout most of human history, funding a war was straightforward and brutally honest. Kings would raise taxes, confiscate wealth, or simply loot conquered territories. Citizens knew exactly what war cost because they felt it immediately in their pockets. During World War I, the British government plastered posters everywhere asking citizens to buy war bonds. The message was clear. Your country needs your money to fight. Taxes were raised dramatically. In the United States, the top marginal tax rate jumped from 7% in 1913 to 77% by 1918. War had a price, and everyone paid it visibly. Even during World War II, considered by many the most justified war in modern history, the U.S. government didn't hide the costs. They sold war bonds directly to citizens through Hollywood stars and propaganda campaigns. Rationing was implemented. People grew victory gardens. Everyone sacrificed together, and everyone knew why. But something changed after World War II. Wars didn't stop. Korea, Vietnam, the Gulf War, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. But the sacrifice asked of ordinary citizens seemed to disappear. Life went on. Shopping continued. Tax rates actually decreased during most of these conflicts. So what changed? The answer lies in three sophisticated mechanisms that most people never learn about: deficit spending and government bonds. The first method is the one governments love to talk about because it sounds responsible: issuing government bonds. Now, this might sound familiar from World War II, but the modern version works very differently. Here's how it works. When the government needs money for a war, it doesn't come to you directly and say, hey, we need $500 billion for this military operation. Instead, the Treasury Department issues bonds, essentially IOUs from the government promising to pay you back with interest in the future. But here's where it gets interesting. During World War II, those bonds were marketed to regular citizens. Your grandmother probably bought war bonds as a patriotic duty. Today, the biggest buyers of government bonds aren't patriotic citizens. They're institutional investors, foreign governments, pension funds, and critically, the Federal Reserve itself. Let me paint a picture of how this works in practice. In 2001, the U.S. national debt was about $5.8 trillion. By 2019, it had ballooned to over $22 trillion. Much of that increase funded the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But you didn't feel it because you weren't asked to buy bonds. The debt was spread across the entire economy and pushed into the future. This is what economists call deficit spending, spending more than you collect in taxes and making up the difference by borrowing. And it's brilliant from a political perspective because the pain is delayed. Future generations will pay for today's wars through higher taxes or reduced services. But by then, the politicians who started the war are long gone. The genius of this system is that it makes war politically cheaper. When citizens had to immediately tighten their belts to fund a war, they asked hard questions. Is this war necessary? Is it worth the cost? But when the cost is hidden in deficit spending, those questions become much softer. There's another layer to this. When the government issues massive amounts of debt to fund a war, interest rates can be kept artificially low through various mechanisms we'll discuss. This creates a perverse incentive structure. The government can borrow almost unlimited amounts without facing the usual market discipline that would force a corporation or individual to reconsider their spending. The Iraq War provides a perfect case study. Economists Joseph Stiglitz and Linda Bilmes calculated the true cost at over $3 trillion when you include long-term veteran care, interest on borrowed money, and economic opportunity costs. But because this cost was spread over decades of deficit spending, the public perception was that the war was far cheaper than it actually was. Monetary expansion and inflation. Now we get to the really controversial part. How governments fund wars by essentially creating money out of thin air. This is where most people's eyes glaze over because it involves central banks and monetary policy. But stay with me because this is where the magic trick really happens. Here's the basic concept. When a government can't or won't raise taxes, and when borrowing through bonds isn't enough, there's a third option. Have the central bank create new money. In the United States, this happens through the Federal Reserve. In Europe, the European Central Bank. In Japan, the Bank of Japan. The details vary, but the mechanism is similar. The process works like this. The Treasury issues bonds to fund war spending, but instead of selling those bonds to private investors, the Federal Reserve buys them directly or indirectly through a process called quantitative easing, or open market operations. Where does the Fed get the money to buy these bonds? This is the mind-bending part. It creates the money electronically, literally. It's sometimes called printing money, but it's actually just numbers in a computer system. Now, you might be thinking, wait, if the government can just create money, why do we pay taxes at all? Great question. The answer is inflation. When you increase the money supply without increasing the goods and services in the economy, each unit of currency becomes worth less. This is inflation. Too much money chasing too few goods. And here's the key insight. Inflation is a hidden tax. It's a tax that doesn't require a vote in Congress. It doesn't appear on your tax return, but it reduces your purchasing power just as surely as if the government had reached into your wallet and taken cash out. During the Vietnam War, this mechanism was used extensively. The Johnson administration wanted both guns and butter to fund the war while maintaining domestic spending programs. Rather than raise taxes significantly and face political backlash, they let the Federal Reserve expand the money supply. The result? The inflation of the 1970s, which peaked at over 13% in 1980. That wasn't just bad luck or oil shocks. It was in part the delayed consequence of financing Vietnam through monetary expansion. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in your daily life. Imagine you have $10,000 in your savings account in 2003 when the Iraq War starts. The government doesn't raise your taxes, so you think, great, this war isn't costing me anything. But over the next decade, as the government finances the war through monetary expansion, inflation averages 2.5% per year. That doesn't sound like much, but by 2013, your $10,000 only has the purchasing power of about $700-800. You've been taxed $2,200 through inflation, but you probably never noticed because it happened gradually. The really insidious part is that inflation doesn't affect everyone equally. If you own assets, real estate, stocks, gold, inflation might actually benefit you because the nominal value of your assets goes up. But if you're a wage earner, a pensioner, or someone on fixed income, inflation slowly erodes your standard of living. So the inflation tax falls heaviest on those least able to afford it. Modern governments have gotten very sophisticated about this. They keep official inflation numbers relatively low, targeting around 2%, which seems harmless. But even 2% inflation means the currency loses half its value every 35 years. And when you factor in asset price inflation, houses, stocks, healthcare, education, the real inflation experienced by ordinary people is often much higher than the official numbers suggest. After the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve bought trillions in government bonds through quantitative easing. Much of this money supported military spending in Iraq and Afghanistan. The Fed's balance sheet exploded from about $900 billion in 2008 to $4.5 trillion by 2015. That's an incredible expansion of the money supply. We didn't see immediate hyperinflation because much of that money stayed in the financial system rather than reaching the real economy, but it distorted asset prices and created enormous wealth inequality. Creative accounting and off-budget spending. The third mechanism is perhaps the most cynical: creative accounting. This is how governments hide the true cost of war by keeping spending off the books or using accounting tricks that would land a corporate CEO in prison. The most common technique is emergency supplemental funding. Here's how it works. When the government creates a budget, military operations are supposed to be included. But for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, much of the spending was categorized as emergency supplemental appropriations, essentially saying each year of a decade-long war was an unexpected emergency. This allowed the administration to exclude war costs from the regular budget and from deficit calculations used in public debate. It's the equivalent of financing your lifestyle on credit cards, but not counting that as part of your budget, because you tell yourself, oh, this is just emergency spending, it doesn't really count. Except you do this every single year. Another technique is cost deferral. The clearest example is veteran healthcare. When a soldier is wounded in combat, the immediate medical costs might be relatively low, but that soldier may require care for the next 50 years. Rather than accounting for that future liability when making the decision to go to war, governments only count the immediate costs. It's like buying a house and only counting the down payment as the cost, ignoring the 30-year mortgage. Economists Stiglitz and Bilmes found that for every dollar the U.S. government officially spent on the Iraq War, there were $2 to $3 in hidden or future costs not included in the official accounting. That's not a small rounding error. That's a fundamental misrepresentation of the true cost. There's also the practice of mixing war spending with regular defense spending. The Department of Defense has never passed an audit. That's right. The one government department that spends over $700 billion a year can't account for where all the money goes. When war spending is mixed into this giant black box of Pentagon accounting, tracking the true cost of any specific war becomes nearly impossible. Then there are contingency funds and classified budgets, black ops, special operations, intelligence activities. These are funded through mechanisms that even most members of Congress can't scrutinize. The war on terror has seen an explosion in this kind of spending, but by its very nature, we can't know the full extent. Some countries use state-owned enterprises or sovereign wealth funds to finance military operations. This keeps the spending off the government's balance sheet entirely. Russia, for example, has used state oil companies to finance military operations in ways that don't appear in official government budgets. There's also the practice of privatization of military functions. When you hire private military contractors like Blackwater, now Academy, instead of using regular military forces, the costs can be categorized as services rather than military spending. This allows governments to wage war while understating the true cost and the true number of personnel involved. During the height of the Iraq War, there were nearly as many private contractors in Iraq as there were U.S. military personnel. But these contractors don't show up in military casualty counts, and their costs are often buried in various budgets far from the public eye. The consequences. So what does all this mean? What are the consequences of funding wars through these hidden mechanisms? First, it breaks the fundamental link between war and sacrifice. When the public doesn't feel the immediate cost of war, the political restraint on entering wars disappears. It's no coincidence that as these mechanisms have become more sophisticated, wars have become more frequent and longer lasting. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq became the longest wars in American history, partly because the public wasn't constantly reminded of the cost. Second, it creates massive intergenerational injustice. The generation that decides to go to war isn't the generation that pays for it. We're passing trillion-dollar bills to our children and grandchildren for wars they had no say in starting. Third, it drives wealth inequality. The inflation and monetary expansion used to fund wars disproportionately benefit asset owners, while hurting wage earners and savers. The period of the post-9/11 wars corresponded with a massive increase in wealth inequality in the United States and other Western countries. Fourth, it undermines democracy. When the true costs of war are hidden through complex financial mechanisms that most people don't understand, how can citizens make informed decisions about whether a war is worth fighting? Democracy requires transparency, and these funding mechanisms are designed to obscure the truth. Finally, it creates economic instability. The massive debts accumulated to fund wars become time bombs in the economic system. The inflation used to manage these debts distorts prices and creates boom-bust cycles. The creative accounting eventually comes home to roost in fiscal crises. So the next time a politician tells you about a military operation or intervention that won't cost taxpayers anything, or when they promise to fund a war without raising taxes, you'll know the truth. The money is coming from somewhere. It's coming from the future value of your savings through inflation. It's coming from the massive debts your children will have to pay. It's coming from complex accounting tricks that hide the true costs until it's too late to matter politically. Wars are expensive. They've always been expensive. What's changed isn't the cost. It's that we've developed sophisticated ways to hide that cost from the public until long after the decision to go to war has been made. Understanding these mechanisms isn't just academic. It's essential for citizenship in a democracy. The power to declare war is supposed to rest with the people, but that power is meaningless if we can't see what war really costs. The next time your country considers military action, Ask not just whether the cause is just, but also who will pay and how. Because one way or another, someone always pays. The only question is whether we're honest about it, or whether we hide the bill until it's too late to do anything about it. Thanks for watching. If this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, please share it. These are conversations we need to be having. And if you want to dive deeper into how money, government, and economics really work, check out the resources in the description below.